So we're going to do one final expansion on the conditional that we started on the if block. And so we're gonna clean this up a little bit as well. I'm going to take out the nested conditionals, and we'll be left with this. Now we've got our two major cases. We've got the greater than or equal to 16 you can drive, and if you're not greater than or equal to 16 you cannot drive. And before we might have said, okay, well, if your age is exactly 15, then we can say you can get a permit, a learner's permit. In many states, when you are not yet 16 but 15, you can get a learner's permit. That's not true for every state, but we're going to use it for this example. So now we've got this code, we can run it, and it works just like we would expect. And we will copy this down because, again, we're starting with the if-else statement. But what we can do is we can actually add more conditions. So really, this is condition 1. You can have several conditions that we check, and we are actually going to throw in a few more conditions. So I'm going to actually delete this code so that we start back with our else. And I'm going to add what's called an else if, right, just before the else. And now notice what I've done. So it looks like about the same. It kind of fits the pattern where you've got after the curly brace some words. Now we've got a condition here, then more curly braces, and we're back in line. The if has a condition. The else does not have a condition, but the else if does have a condition. So what we need to do in here is we need to actually throw in right here, else if condition 2. And then in here we'll say else if code. Now the if code only runs when condition 1 is true. The else if code only runs when condition 2 is true, but only if condition 1 was false. And we'll talk about what this means in just a moment. And the else code only runs when, instead of saying the condition, we will say all conditions are false. Okay. And so we will add in here and say try a permit. So here's what happens. Just like we saw before with the if and even with the if else, this whole block of code only runs one time. So even if I change age after the fact, this code doesn't run again unless I run the program again. But here's what happens. Let's look at this example with age equal to 19. So we print the code before, that's fine. Then we check age. Is age greater than or equal to 16? 19 is greater than or equal to 16, so it prints this statement. Then all the rest of the block is totally skipped. It's like it's not even there. And then we print the last statement. Now let's say I bump it down to 13. And we'll actually run this and we'll compare it to the result. Before the block, you cannot drive after the block. So we run this line, no problem. Then we check. Is age greater than or equal to 16? 13? No, it is not. So instead of skipping directly to the else, we just move down to the else if. Is age exactly equal to 15? Age is equal to 13, so it is not exactly equal to 15. So we have to go down and we get to the else. Since that condition was not true and that condition was not true, we have reached the else. Nothing else was true, so we're going to run you cannot drive. And that's what we see here. And then we get to after the block. And then we'll try the special case that we've been talking about just now is 15. We'll run Java. We get our output. This ran like we expected. Okay, 15 is not greater than or equal to 16. So again, instead of skipping directly to the else, we do have to run through and check the other conditions. Else if, is age exactly 15? It is, so we say try a permit. And then we get to the else, but we actually met our condition, so we actually don't go to the else. It's like the else isn't even there. So the else becomes a little less powerful here, but because it becomes harder to get to. You only run the else if none of the conditions were true. And the powerful thing with else if is you can actually add, we'll say we can add more of these. We can do some exactly equals and say, you know, system.out.println. We'll say almost. And now we have 3 conditions we can check. So the thing with an if and an else block, right? This is no longer the if else statement. This is the if else statement. Again, it just runs one time, but it runs through every condition here. And so you can have as many of these else ifs as you need, but you have to be careful because we start with the first condition and we check every condition until we find one that works. If we don't find any that work, then we go to the else. And again, if the else is not there, nothing happens. So really, and this is where it gets kind of confusing the first time you see it, you could actually rewrite all of this code, and I'm going to do it here, like this. So I'll extract all that, else. Okay, got all that. Copy all that. Okay, and I think that is it. So these 2 sections of code do the exact same thing. One of them is more readable than the other, though. The first section has much less nesting. Everything is kind of at the same level. It's all at the same indentation, so it's easier to read. Here, you say if, else, go into the else. If, else, go into the else. Else, go into the else. And every time you add an else if, that's kind of what you're doing here. And so the first way is much easier to read and easier to write as a programmer, and so it's a more powerful tool. But this is also where a lot of first-time programmers are going to stumble, because let's look at a different example. Let's say I want to check my grade. Let's say that my grade is an 85. We'll say if grade is, let's say, less than 100, then we will print out an A. And we'll say else if the grade is less than a 90. We'll put an eatable in here. Yeah. Then we'll get a B. Then we'll say else if the grade is less than an 80, it'll be a C. And then we'll say else if grade is less than or equal to 70, it's a D. And then we'll say else dot println, then we'll say the grade is an F. Right? So that kind of matches up, right? We have, if it's, a 90 to 100, it's an A. If it's less than a 90, it's a B, C, D, E, F, and so on. So if we run this code, though, it says we got an A. That's because 85 is less than or equal to 100. It did meet the first condition, so it never even checked the second condition. Right? Even if I went with 60 here, it's going to tell me that I got an A because it only checked the first condition. Now there's a couple of ways to solve this. One is we could add some AND checks, right? The grade has to be greater than or equal to 90, and the grade has to be less than or equal to 100, right? If we did that, that would fix this condition, but now if I run it, it's probably going to register that I got a B, because yes, I didn't meet this condition. This is a compound condition that we saw before, but I met this condition. My grade is less than 90. So you got to be careful here, because one way to solve this would have actually been to say, okay, well, what if I turn this on its head? If the grade is less than 60, we'll say it's an F. If the grade is less than 70, it's a D. If the grade is less than 80, it's a C. If the grade is less than 90, it's a B. Else, the grade is an A. Now if I run this, I get what I expect. And the reason for that is, if the grade is less than 60, less than 70, less than 80, less than 90, all these conditions overlap. Right? If we looked before, when we had the original code here, go just a little bit more, there we go. These also overlap a pretty good bit. A grade can be less than 100 and less than 90 and less than 80. But in the new way, a grade can still be, these are still the exact same conditions, just in different order, except for the 60 and the 100, but the ones in the middle are exactly the same. But what we've done is we've taken advantage of the if, else block, saying, okay, once a condition is met, I stop. So I start with the lowest grade that'll give me a letter, and I work my way up, because once a condition is met, then no other conditions are checked. In the first case, we had the problem of getting a 75. That would be true for the condition we had for an A, and for the B, and for the C. So it could have been any of them, but it would stop with the first one. Here we still have that, and it will still stop with the first one, but in this case, the first one is the one that matches. So this is where you start to kind of see the logic in programming and how important it is to exercise good logic and to make sure that the conditions you're imposing make sense. But this kind of wraps up the discussion on the if, else block. And so anything you can do with these now is you can introduce branches into your code and more complex branches. You can use multiple conditions for this. You can use nested ifs and else ifs and else's. The big thing to remember is that it will execute every condition until it finds the first one that works. It will only execute the conditions until it finds one that works. And the else will only be run if none of the conditions are met. And the else does not have a condition. The only other thing is that remember that this block of code only gets run one time because the code still has to go in sequential order, and if you only wrote the code once, it'll only execute once. But just because you wrote the code means it may or may not execute because we have now introduced the concept of branches. So this will kind of lead us into another challenge where we can kind of expand on what we've been looking at, and we can talk more about other ways to branch after the challenge.